All right, last time we were together, last Wednesday night, we were under a big section of the book of Hebrews that points out Jesus is in a superior tabernacle, remember? We talked about the fact that the tabernacle on earth was patterned after the one in heaven. And apparently Moses had the privilege to see that when he was on the mountain that we've just been talking about on Sunday mornings. And that he offered a superior sacrifice. You see why this is important, because we have talked ad nauseum about the condition of the people that are hearing this and their attractiveness, or maybe even their desire to not experience persecution and wanting to ease back into the sacrificial system and maybe do some of those things to lighten the persecution on them. And so the writer is very clearly explaining to them the tabernacle sacrifice, the tabernacle worship, all of those things were just a shadow. And what Jesus did was to fulfill that. And that was important for them to know. So last time we talked about the superiority of Christ's sacrifice. And you remember we talked about the fact that in fact, if you have your notes, on page 47, and by the way, I was thinking I brought another, maybe I didn't bring another one in. Probably won't get to it anyway. All right, so last time we talked about that his sacrifice was superior. And one of the things we talked about in the purification section last time was the fact that in verses 13 and 14, in fact, I'll just read those and kind of briefly go over that. The writer writes in 9:13, "For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling those who have been defiled sanctify for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God?" And we talked about what he's referring to is the Day of Atonement. He's referring to how they used the ashes of the red heifer to cleanse. The Day of Atonement was for group cleansing, if you will. In other words, it was, remember, done once a year, and based on that, the high priest going in and offering that blood, then Israel was guiltless until somebody had a bad thought or something, and then it started all over again, accumulating for another year. And then we also talked about individually, they used the ashes of the red heifer to cleanse individuals when they sinned. And they also used some of that stuff to cleanse the utensils and that type of thing. Well, but there was a great difference, right, between the blood of bulls and goats and the blood of Christ. Because the blood of bulls and goats could only cover, we talked about last week, the atonement. The word, actually in theology, we use the word atonement to talk about the work of Christ, but literally in Hebrew, the word atonement simply means to cover. And so as we talked about last week, it could clear their, it could ceremonially clear them, but it couldn't clear their conscience. They still knew that they sinned, and they still knew that they did something. And of course, the blood of Christ could do far more than that. It could clear the conscience totally, because his blood was sufficient to pay for the sins of mankind and to free them to serve God. And Paul deals with that in Romans chapter 6. We've talked about that a lot, it seems like, the last several years, where under the Mosaic law you had that ceremonial cleansing, and before God they used the blood of the animals. But in the work of Christ, we not only can be forgiven, but through the blood of Christ we were set free to live a holy life. In other words, we consider ourselves dead to the sin nature. And that's what Paul talks about in Romans 6. So that we are free to make a choice. See, they never were at that point. The Mosaic law couldn't do that. It couldn't free them from bondage to the sin nature. But because the blood of Christ, because of its superiority, its perfect holiness, it would free us. So in verses 15 through 22, this is what we read. For this reason, and the reason is what we just talked about, the ability of Christ's blood to cleanse us and to cleanse our conscience as well. For this reason, he is the mediator of a new covenant. We just observed the Lord's Supper, which is part of the meal that Jesus had with the apostles. It's the redemption part, the redemption cup. And we've done that a couple of times toward the end of the year. We've walked through that and talked about it. And by the way, in March, and I don't have it in my mind the exact date, but in March, a student from Dallas Seminary who is part of Friends of Israel is going to come, and we're going to do the Seder again like we did several years ago over in the gym. So if you've never been a part of a Jewish Seder, this is your opportunity. And of course, this guy's a Jew, but he's a Messianic Jew. He recognizes Jesus as Messiah. And so as he goes through that meal that Orthodox Jews do it. They just don't recognize that the Messiah has already come when they do it. And so he's going to come and he's going to do that with us. He's going to send something beforehand. So just like y'all did last year, a lot of the ladies prepared all of that stuff. We'll have the bitter herbs and all that kind of stuff. So it'll be kind of cool. And so he'll be doing that. I'm sorry?
It's April the 12th.
April the 12th, okay, April. So if you want to mark that on your calendars, April the 12th. And he will also be speaking to us as well on Sunday morning. All right, so for this reason, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that since a death has taken place for the redemption of the transgressions that were committed under the first covenant, the Mosaic covenant he's referring to, those who have been called may receive the promise of eternal inheritance. Quite different. For where a covenant, and it's interesting, he uses the same term here, but contextually, the word covenant here we would probably translate more like a will, like a last will and testament. So watch what he says here. For where a will is, there must of necessity be the death of the one who made it. So think of a will. Somebody makes a will, that goes in force when they die. So for a covenant is valid only when men are dead, for it is never in force while the one who made it lives. Therefore, even the first covenant, which was again the Mosaic covenant, was not inaugurated. Now he's switching back to the idea of a covenant as we normally would understand it. Therefore, even the first Mosaic was not inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment had been spoken by Moses to all the people, according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats with water and scarlet and wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all of the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you." In fact, I want us to go ahead and turn back. I know we're about to do, we're not about to do it because Jonathan's teaching, and that's chapter 24, and we're only on 19. So it's going to take him a while, and aren't we going to do one commandment a Sunday? Which I totally agree with, by the way. You cannot do justice to the 10 Commandments, doing 10 Commandments on one Sunday, or even a couple. So I appreciate him doing that. We're not in a race to get through with Exodus or anything else that we're teaching, by the way. You've probably noticed that. So I'm going to go ahead and read this because it'll be several Sundays, maybe next year probably, before we get into chapter 24. So this is after they've received the covenant, and this is what it says. This is 24:1. Then he said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. You shall worship at a distance. And Moses alone, however, shall come near to the Lord, but they shall not come near, nor shall the people come up with him." And that was, we talked about that last week or the week before. They said if somebody comes close, shoot them. And I'm assuming that was with a bow and arrow. I thought about that Sunday. Obviously it wasn't an AR or something, so probably a bow and arrow. That's God saying that, by the way. And with reason, because he is holy. Okay, then Moses came and recounted to the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words which the Lord has spoken we will do." Verse 4, Moses wrote down all the words. I'm sure just like us, they were convinced that they could do it, We're so self-confident, with living holy until we try to live holy. So Moses wrote down all the words. Was somebody going to say something? Are you looking for where we're at? Okay, Exodus chapter 24. I'm sorry. Everybody there? Exodus chapter 24, verse 4. Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Then he arose early in the morning, and he built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the sons of Israel, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls. That's what the writer of Hebrews is referring to this, that we just wrote. They offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as peace offerings to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in the basins, and the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. So this is what the guy's talking about, the author of Hebrews. And then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." So Moses took the blood and he sprinkled it on the people. Again, that's what the writer of Hebrews said. And said, "Behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all of these words." So this is what he's referring to here when he's talking about the first covenant. He said, "For when every commandment had been spoken by Moses to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats and the water and the scarlet wool and the hyssop, and he sprinkled both the book itself and all of the people. The book, I'm assuming the book here is referring to the Ten Commandments that he brought down. Okay. Saying, this is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you. So, a cutting of the covenant, that's what they used to call it. That's what we saw Abraham. In fact, God did it with Abraham, remember? He cut the animals in two. They were supposed to walk through them. There was a cutting of the covenant. There had to be blood to ratify a covenant. And so that's what's going on here. And in the same way, he sprinkled both the tabernacle and all of the vessels of the ministry with the blood. Again, this is the tabernacle that he told them to build. And according to the law, one may also say, all things are cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. So, since the sacrifices of the Old Covenant were limited, Christ came and offered himself. So all of that was just a picture of what Christ would come and do. That's what he's trying to tell them. And this didn't accomplish temporary redemption. It accomplished eternal redemption. That's why once we're saved, we're saved. For believers, through the new covenant, when we put our faith in Christ, we are saved. The author has already stated that Jesus as high priest mediates through a better covenant. Remember, back in chapter 8, he emphasized this is a better covenant than the covenant you're trying to go back to. This new covenant, a better covenant. And it's enacted on better promises. I mean, if you think about what we just talked about, the old covenant was, the promises were temporary forgiveness. And then we have to do it again. And the Levitical handbook, which is Leviticus in our Bibles, had different sacrifices for each kind of offense, as maybe we'll someday study verse by verse. So he now explains that Jesus' death provided redemption for the transgressions made under the first covenant. And this was important since the blood of animals only covered our sins. So we talked about that. And as he points out here, because of this, it gives us eternal inheritance. Our inheritance is guaranteed. It is secure. So in verses 16 and 17, the author switches to the idea of a will, as we just talked about. Someone had to die. And you think about what we just did Sunday before last, when we observe the Lord's Supper. That is about the new covenant, and it is about his body being broken and his blood being poured out, which was the equal but infinitely better than what we just read about in the Old Covenant. It was the blood, but it was perfect blood. It was superior blood of the Lamb of God. And so in verses 18 through 22, he illustrates this, and now he switches back to the idea of a covenant, where there was ratification through his blood. And back then, the ratification was conditional, but because he took his blood and he offered it in the tabernacle in heaven, and his blood was perfect. That's why we see in several scriptures he offers that and then he sits down, as we've already talked about. It's completed. It's over. It's finished. Verse 23, Therefore it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. So the blood of bulls and goats cleansed the things on heaven. They didn't cleanse the conscience. But in the heavenly tabernacle, there had to be something better. It says in verse 24, for Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, right? He didn't enter a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us as our intermediary, our intercessor, our advocate, our high priest.
Is that where he tells Mary not to hold on to him because he hasn't gone with the Father? Is that when that happens?
You know, I don't remember. I remember that passage, but I don't remember him saying. I remember him saying that, but I don't remember in context what that means. That's a good question. Anybody? Jonathan? When he tells Mary not to hold on to him because he hadn't ascended to the Father yet.
Was that when he was showing himself to the apostles, or like, because it wasn't at the, when they came, because when she came to the tomb, she didn't realize that was him.
Right.
So it was after that, so.
It was after that.
So was it like when he was revealing himself to the, I don't know.
I don't remember. Before I answer that, I'd want to go back and look at the context to remember, Gene, but that's an excellent question. Okay, so this is the big question. The question is, hold on just a minute. Why? I want y'all to think about this and then we'll talk about it. So why does Jesus need to go into the heavenly tabernacle? This tabernacle's in heaven, and cleanse it with his blood. Why? What is he cleansing it from? I'm going to admit something. I had never thought about this before until I started studying this passage. And I've been through Hebrews, but I don't ever remember dealing with this. But it's very interesting. Because don't we think of heaven, everything's holy in heaven, right? Yeah, right off the bat, again, we talked about Job being the oldest book. Right off the bat, in the oldest book, we see that he still has access to God. He's in submission to God, but he has access to God. Well, let's talk about it. I actually am just going to read to you from Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum what he says about this. And let's think with him through this. He says, first, when Satan rebelled against God, he did so while he was in heaven. And thus, Satan's rebellion brought sin into heaven itself. And you look, if you have your notes, if you don't have notes, that's Isaiah 14, 12 through 14. Remember, that's the I will exalt myself above God, and I will do this, and I will do that. That's the section on Satan where he says that. And then Ezekiel 28, 11 through 19 is, again, these are, cryptic may not be the best term for them, but what you see in both of those passages is the context is talking about an evil person on earth. And it appears that Isaiah and Ezekiel both, in talking about that person, looks beyond. I think it's the king of Tyre in one of them. He looks beyond him to the one that is actually running them, and starts to talk about that king in a way that could not fit him. Do y'all know the passages I'm talking about? Maybe we should look at those right quick. We've got 5 minutes, and we'll turn to Isaiah chapter 14. First, turn to Ezekiel. Turn to Ezekiel 28. I think we need to do that first. Ezekiel chapter 28. So in Ezekiel 28, the context is the king of Tyre. In fact, when you start in 28:1, it talks about the leader of Tyre, and everything lines up with a human being. But then when you hit verse 11, Ezekiel, remember Ezekiel's in Babylon. He's receiving these visions. And in verse 11 it says, again the word of the Lord, or Revelations, again the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation over the king of Tyre, and say, so now it's calling him king of Tyre, and say to him, thus says the Lord God, you had the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. If he's talking about perfection, he would be talking about just after the creation. Because remember, once the fall came, there wasn't any more perfection. It says, you were in Eden, the garden of God. Well, there weren't many people in Eden, right? I mean, you don't have a lot to choose from in the Garden of Eden. You got Adam and Eve, and in chapter 3 you got the serpent, which it's interesting. It mentions the serpent in chapter 3, and it's all the way to Revelation chapter 20 before it says the serpent of old, Satan, and the devil, and is given all of his names, But this is Satan. It says, for you were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. The ruby, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, the jasper, the lapis lazuli. I never have figured out exactly how to say that. I'm probably mispronouncing it. It's beautiful. That stone is a deep blue. It's absolutely gorgeous. The turquoise and the emerald and the gold, the workmanship of your setting and sockets was in you. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were the anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until the unrighteousness was found in you. By the abundance of your trade, you were internally filled with violence, and you sinned. Therefore, I have cast you as profane from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. And on, down to verse 19, I think is where the context is. So this is an explanation of who Satan was, his exalted position. And in Isaiah 14, we have a passage that indicates this is 14, starting in verse 12. And again, the context of this starts in verse 3 of 14. And in verse 4 it says this is talking about the king of Babylon. Now, probably again, what this is you have both of those were very evil kings, right? And so, in the inspiration of God, he chose to give revelation of who was behind those guys. This is why they're so evil, you know. And then we have in the book of Daniel an insight into the fact that, and in Ephesians we have this. It gives us the idea of the fact that what Satan did when he failed, he created a structure of authority imitating God in the angelic realm and placed powerful demons over countries and that type of thing. And so we never escape from that, by the way. As much as God allows, they influence leaders and nations, and obviously those who are not believers, he can influence even more. So you see why the world can be such an evil place full of evil people. You know, and things. I was just kind of trying to get ready for this Sunday and kind of revisiting some of the things that Hamas did when they crossed the border. And it was unspeakable, the things. Just definitely demonic. I believe some of the rioting going on in our country today is demonic. There's no doubt about it. So Satan never sleeps, and his minions, if you will, the demons are not sleeping. But this is why it speaks of Satan in the context of these evil men. This is what verse 12 says. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning. This is Lucifer. That's, in some Bibles, is translated Lucifer, right? King James, does it say Lucifer in verse 12? Yeah. Son of the dawn, you have been cut down to the earth. You who have weakened the nations, but you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. This was his plan. I'll ascend to heaven. I'll raise my throne above the stars of God. And stars, probably there, is not talking about the ones you can see. The word star is many times used for an angelic being in Old Testament prophecy. So, O star of the morning, son of the dawn, let's see. Verse 13, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. So that was his goal. Being the anointed cherub was not enough for him. He wanted we can speculate, and probably what I've heard people speculate on makes sense. In other words, within the plan and purpose of God, God gave angelic beings a period of time to make choice, to have choice in the beginning. This was according to his plan and purpose. And, covering cherub would be a cherub that's right there before the throne of God, protecting the throne of God, probably something like the four living creatures that it talks about in Ezekiel and also Revelation chapter 4 and 5 and chapter 4. And as he observed the worship that God constantly got from angelic beings, he wanted that. It wasn't enough to be the top angel. He wanted the worship of God. So his goal was to become that. And that, if he was the covering cherub, he was in heaven. He was in the throne room of God. And so as Christ died on the cross and he took the blood into the tabernacle in heaven. And remember, so think about this, putting this all together. So the tabernacle in heaven must be where the throne room of God is, right? Because on earth in the tabernacle was the Ark of the Covenant, but the mercy seat represented the place of God. And when the glory of God came and filled that place, that's where he filled it, and in the temple too. And so I'm just thinking through this. Sometimes you just kind of start to put things together, and so that place had to have been what we see in Revelation 4 and 5. I don't know. I'm just thinking through this, Jonathan. If you have any thoughts on this, and so that place was affected by the sin. In fact, it was affected so much by the sin that Revelation 12 tells us that if we're interpreting that right in the beginning of Revelation 12, a third of the angels made that same choice to follow Satan. And so it had quite an impact on heaven. So I just want to kind of bring all that out and not just kind of skip over it. These are not things we study all the time. These are kind of unique things. But it says the Ezekiel passage states that he defiled the sanctuary in heaven. For this reason, the heavens were not clean. Second, man is united with creation. When man sinned, his sin reached even heaven. And that is why Colossians 1:20 teaches that when Jesus dies, he reconciled things. Think about this. You know, sometimes we're reading the Bible and we read these words and we don't really think of what every word means and what exactly is this saying. I know we've read this before, but did we think about what it meant? Reconcile things in heaven as well on earth. To reconcile things in heaven as well on earth. Colossians 1:20. There had to be some reconciliation in heaven too. These reasons, the heavenly tabernacle needed the cleansing of better blood, or as the NASB says, better sacrifices than the blood of bulls and goats. So Jesus had to go and cleanse the heavenly tabernacle where the throne room of God is of the sin of Lucifer, of Satan. And the sin of all of the other angels that left, a third of them. You're probably not going to get that on some theological test somewhere, but you know it now, okay? And sometimes we read these things and we think, I don't know what that means. And this was a new one for me. It makes sense. It fits. It makes sense as well. So anyway, next Wednesday night, I'll be on vacation. So Jonathan will be teaching, and he'll finish up just these last several verses of chapter 9 and maybe going to chapter 10. Unless he takes one verse per week. Which nobody here cares, to be honest. We love that. So, all right. Jonathan, could you close us on a word of prayer, please?
Lord, we thank you for this night. Thank you for our time of study. We thank you that we have the superior sacrifice